Welcome to Loop TV. I'm your host, Gene Munster, along with Andrew Murphy. Our topic today is the Mac growth will continue. We're, of course, referring to Apple's Mac business. A little bit of a setup here is the Mac business is about 12% of Apple's overall revenue. Over the last 10 years, it has been up and down. It's kind of hit or miss. Over the last 5 years, it's been up on average of 1%. This is before the pandemic. So it has not been a stellar segment. It has been reliable, but not any growth to get excited about. The last 3 quarters, the growth has been something to be excited about. On average, it's been up 24%. It's the first time in 10 years that the company has grown Mac revenue in that 20% range. And last data point is Mac accounts for about 8% of the global computer market share. That's based on IDC numbers. For those historians, present company included, that is the similar market shares that Apple has had for the past 15 years. Really hasn't moved the needle. So here we are today talking about why Mac growth is going to continue. I'll bring you in, Andrew. Today we're out kind of with some analysis about these tailwinds that the Mac business is going to have for the next few years. Love for you to frame in what those tailwinds are and why this segment could surprise investors over the next few years.
Yeah, it's fun to talk about the Mac in this resurgence of its life cycle. I think that we've called it the accelerating digital transformation that's underway, and the pandemic that has accelerated further the digital transformation. What we're talking about here is basically people working from anywhere, kids learning at home, and increased demand for Apple devices, specifically the Mac, for productivity at work and in school. So I think that the first thing that comes to mind when I look at those growth rates going up like they have since the pandemic, it's working from anywhere and learning from home. People wanting to get their hands on a Mac that works as well as their phone does.
And so maybe when we think about the sustainability of that, it's not as, we can look back in the rearview mirror and see that kind of growth, but what makes you optimistic that that growth is going to continue?
Well, yeah, what makes me optimistic is in some ways a pessimism around the return to normal. In other words, we're not going back to the way we used to operate, right? Working in the office at our desks with our work issued computers. We're not going back to travel, business travel like it was before. That old world is gone, and the pandemic has ushered in a new world, and it's one that will benefit the Mac business. So I think the permanence of many of these habits that we've learned, because in some ways they're just better ways to operate, like working from anywhere. The permanence of that is what gives me optimism for the Mac business.
We've seen, at least on the work front, is at the height of the pandemic, about 90% of US information workers were not in the office. That number has now dropped a little bit. It's about 80% are not in the office. Before the pandemic, it was just under 10% of people were not in the office. And so there is still a long ways for that to go down. And we have historically thought that this number was going to kind of settle out at around 20%. A lot of numbers here, but essentially going from 85% of people working from remote to 20%. Our revised expectations based on some productivity numbers that we continue to see that have been favorable during the pandemic is that that number will be 25%. So that's more people. That equates to about 10 million additional people in the US would be working remote, at least for part of the time. And in a typical year, Apple sells about 20 million Macs. So it's a tailwind. Agree with you there. But when we think about this work dynamic, isn't it work always been at odds with the Mac? Hasn't corporate America always preferred a PC? And are they going to give in?
Well, I think that that has been a very slow shift, and you've seen it in some of the lag in the halo effect, actually, that we may have expected a decade ago. We would have expected the Mac business to perform better over time, and big companies haven't shifted to the Mac. But there's been a couple things in the last few years that I think have unlocked more demand from business users. One is the rise of SaaS solutions that work just as well on a Mac than they do on a PC, versus the Office and Windows ecosystem that work so tightly together. That's no longer the case.
Oh, I
The
just had a
other,
flashback to going to Fry's, their software section, and the PC section was hundreds of titles, and then the Mac section was over in the corner with a dozen titles. No more.
right, and now we're just operating within the browser primarily, and it works just as well on your Mac as it does on your PC. Dropbox would be a good example of a solution that's been adopted by the enterprise. Slack, email. So the second piece of it, I think, is the prominence of Apple devices like the phone and the iPad, and people wanting to potentially even bring their own device to the ecosystem. And maybe work does issue a PC and they get a Mac for $1,000 just because they want to use that with all of those various software solutions we were just talking about. And they run them in parallel, potentially at home.
Sense, and can see why there is room for optimism around just inching ever so further into the corporate side. Another tailwind that you've talked about over the next few years is the M1 chip. Why is this such a big deal? And as just a quick background here, is Apple last fall updated the M1 on a handful of Macs. It equates to about 65% of the Mac units. So they haven't done the full lineup yet, but why should we be paying attention to the M1?
Well, as a lifelong Mac user, Apple user, I was actually skeptical of the transformative nature of this M1 chip that Apple billed as a huge leap forward in the Mac and speed and operation. And to my delight, uh, the MacBook Air that I use with an M1 chip is the best Mac I've ever used. And I would say the Mac is finally a Mac, right? Where it feels like it runs just as snappy as an iPad or a phone. All of a sudden, it boots up right away. It doesn't make noise. The fingerprint ID reader is snappy, and everything just works like you expect an Apple product too. So I've been surprised at how much of a leap forward the M1 chip really is. And I think that that step up in quality is driving some of this growth.
For those of you who are new to Andrew's work, the snappy test has been something that he has written about for the last 15 years. Great to hear about that snappy
What's the
test. Is
user
still
experience,
the
right? It's
user
the
experience,
product
exactly.
experience that I think is so important. And they've nailed it with these M1 Macs.
So that will be, not everyone goes out and spends $1,000 on a computer every month. Therefore, there's some kind of continuation. If we put it together and kind of think about the model, put those two tailwinds together and think about the Mac business again, about 12% of revenue. Is this year, the street is expecting it to grow at around 7%. The comps get difficult this year. We're in line with that expectation. For fiscal 22, we're expecting 5% growth. Analysts are expecting 2% growth, so we're a little bit ahead of that. Where we start to deviate more is in fiscal 23, which will be here before you know it. And we're expecting the Mac business to grow at 5%, and the street is expecting down 4%. So strong, solid, mid-single digit growth from the Mac business. That's different than its flattish over the last few years. Thank you, Accelerating Digital Transformation. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us and enlightening us on the future of this iconic product from Apple. On behalf of Andrew, I'm Gene and Loup TV. Bye for now.